A white cop taps the glass with his baton. An elderly black man slowly steps out, hands trembling, head steady. He barely gets both feet on the ground before he's shoved down. No blood spilled, but something far deeper broke. His cap flew off. His military badge hit the dirt. No one helped him up. No one said a word. And right then, the town's own conscience hit the pavement too. But that wasn't just any old man. It was Raymond Elias Ford, a war hero once honored at Fort Bragg, a man who saved dozens of soldiers in Vietnam, and now, publicly disrespected like he never existed at all. What if that was your grandfather? If justice can forget a hero, what happens to the rest of us? What state are you watching from? And where you live, is silence morality or complicity? That shove didn't just knock a man down. It woke up a memory this town tried to bury. At high noon, the sun scorched every brick along Mapleview Avenue, right at the corner where an old convenience store sat still, like it was holding its breath. A 1993 Ford Ranger, its paint peeling and tires crackling against the burning asphalt, rolled to a stop at the curb. The brakes hissed quietly, a sound no one noticed except the man behind the wheel. Raymond Elias Ford, 76 years old, a Black American war veteran living quietly in Glenfield Heights. He wore a frayed collar shirt and an old cap stitched with a paratrooper emblem, jammy, with honor. His hands, sun-darkened and calloused by decades of holding a rifle, gripped the steering wheel like he was cradling the memories of a life once lived in full. Raymond didn't realize the police car behind him had its lights on. Officer Matthew Taylor, a white man in his early 20s, full of arrogance and bias, had just stepped out of his cruiser. His blue uniform shirt clung to a muscular frame. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes, and he swung his baton like it was the highest badge of authority. "Look at this rust bucket," Matthew sneered, approaching the driver's window and tapping it with his baton. He leaned in, smirking. "Looks like you drove this thing straight out of the cemetery, Grandpa. Let me see your paperwork." Raymond said nothing. Slowly, he pulled a worn registration document from his shirt pocket and passed it through the window. His hand trembled, but his gaze remained calm. Matthew snatched the paper, skimmed it, then scoffed. "This," he laughed, "is this registration or a greasy napkin?" He tossed the papers back, letting them scatter across the driver's seat. "Step out. Full vehicle search." His voice wasn't an order. It was legalized threat. Raymond opened the door. Every movement was slow, deliberate, like a military march slowed to half-tempo. He barely had both feet on the ground before Matthew shoved him hard in the chest. Raymond fell forward onto the pavement. The fall didn't draw blood, but it ripped open something deeper. His cap flew off, and an old military badge rolled toward Matthew's feet. Matthew looked down, nudged the badge with his boot like it was trash. "What is this, a medal for garbage?" he muttered, then kicked it lightly to the dusty curb. A set of car keys flew from Raymond's pocket and clinked into a nearby storm drain. Raymond didn't scream. He didn't fight back. He bent down, picked up his cap and the badge. His fingers were rough like red Georgia soil, the kind that buried soldiers. His eyes never landed on Matthew. They stared into the space where honor had just been trampled. People watched, but no one stepped forward. No words were spoken. The sun kept pouring down, relentless. And Raymond, still standing, like a tree without roots, but refusing to fall. He knelt, his knee touching the blistering ground, as if bowing to something long gone. The small badge, a symbol of a paratrooper brigade once feared in the Far East, lay in the dust like a relic from a lost century. He picked it up with trembling fingers and wiped the dirt away with the cuff of his shirt. The eagle clutching a spear still gleamed, weathered but unbroken. From inside a nearby auto shop, a clock struck 3 times, 3 p.m. The sunlight sliced through the heat like a blade. But still no one spoke. No one moved. No one helped. They just watched, like they were witnessing a car crash they couldn't unsee but dare not touch. Across the street, an elderly couple holding hands walked quickly away, avoiding eye contact with the old man gathering the fragments of his life. At the corner, a young mother named Desiree Holloway clutched her grocery bag tightly. Her little daughter, Naira Elston, clung to her skirt and whispered, "Mommy, Why did that man push him? Desiree didn't answer. She just squeezed her daughter's hand tighter, her eyes cast downward, trapped by a question she herself was too afraid to face. A few steps away, a young man named Jalen Reddick, his cap turned backward, discreetly pulled out his phone. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. Still, he said nothing. He didn't step forward. He couldn't, because everyone knew. Stepping in meant trouble, meant danger, meant consequences that people like Raymond knew too well. And people like Jalen were still learning to survive. Matthew Taylor snorted, turned, and walked back to his cruiser like he'd just want to fight. "Start walking, old man," he spat, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the silence like the final blow to a dignity already torn apart. Raymond still hadn't spoken. He quietly gathered the scattered papers in his car. Every movement was like a ritual, silent, steady, like preparing the belongings of a fallen comrade. He eased back into the driver's seat, staring through the windshield. Not Matthew, but at the sun lowering over Wexley Borough. In that gaze, there was no rage, no demand. Only a man who refused to let his self-respect be defined by someone wearing uniform they didn't understand. A soft summer breeze carried the sound of cicadas and the scent of fresh asphalt. In the silence, the only thing that echoed was resilience. No one needed a shout to shake the earth. One look, one rise without help, was enough to make a town feel small. And today, Wexley Borough began to bow. Not to an old man, but as something they had forgotten far too long: silent dignity. On the stone steps outside the convenience store, Jalen Reddick sat motionless, his eyes locked onto the phone screen, where a less-than-a-minute video looped for the third time. Raymond Elias Ford being shoved, his badge hitting the ground, and Matthew Taylor, whose name everyone in Wexley Borough knew, kicking away like a piece of trash. Every replay made Jalen's heart pound harder in his chest, like the insult had landed on him too. Without a word, he opened the app, tapped Post to Group, and added a short caption. Who is this man? And why didn't anyone stop it? Then he hit upload. One tap, like pulling the safety pin on a bomb this town had buried under its foundation for decades. Within 10 minutes, the video had over 200 shares. On the west side of town, inside a small bar where veterans gathered every evening, Caldera Pavilion, the usual chatter fell silent as the video appeared on the corner TV screen. Blue light flickered across the weathered face of Silas Granger, a veteran who had served in Kuwait. His beer paused midair. His jaw tightened. "Raymond Ford," he muttered, setting his glass down with a sharp clink. "No way in hell I'm letting this get buried like everything else in this town." A broad-shouldered man beside him, wearing a faded t-shirt with Semper Fi across the chest, rose to his feet. "We don't need to march. We need to remember who we used to be." Nods followed. No speeches, no calls to action. Someone shouted, "Share the damn clip." And like a signal flare, trembling fingers began to tap in unison. A spark had been lit. At a small cafe near the elementary school, where young mothers like Desiree Holloway often stopped after pickup, notification chimes rang out from phones around the room. They gathered to watch. No one said a word, but their eyes had changed. One woman leaned toward Desiree and asked quietly, "That boy in the photo, is he his grandson?" Desiree nodded slightly, not certain, but enough to understand. That child's face would be remembered. That child was the future they could no longer protect by staying quiet. Across town in the South End, a middle-aged man quietly shared the video to the Georgia Veterans Network, then to smaller groups, retired Marines, paratroopers, veterans in Ashwood. Comments rolled in fast. "Unbelievable. On American soil? If we stay silent now, we lose the right to ever hold our heads up again." Each share was a hammer blow to the town's fragile illusion of peace. And for the first time in years, Wexley Borough began to hear itself, through angry keystrokes, through eyes that could no longer look away. A question rang louder than any Sunday church bell. If today it's Raymond Elias Ford, who will it be tomorrow? Less than 2 hours after the video went live, the mood across Wexley had shifted. Not with protests, not with sirens, but with a quiet current swelling beneath porches, cafes, and living rooms. People who once dismissed police overreach were now whispering, nodding, texting. The things they'd once ignored out of fear could no longer be unseen. On the east side of town, in the basement of the Veterans Community Center, Silas Granger stood in front of a chalkboard. His name was now circulating online, not for his service in Kuwait, but for a short post he'd written, attaching the video. If we once carried rifles for honor, then this is the time to stand for it. The room filled slowly. Men with bent backs from years of labor, but eyes still sharp as the day they returned from war. One of them, Tobias Reed, a former police officer, reached into his pocket and pulled out a rusted badge he had taken off 15 years ago. "The last time I wore this," he said hoarsely, "was the day I realized I couldn't protect anyone anymore." He looked around. "Today, I want to wear it again. Not to arrest, but to remind folks who actually deserves to be called a protector." In a small home near the farmer's market, Desiree Holloway tucked her daughter into bed, then sat at the kitchen table. Her phone screen glowed, message after message pouring into the Wexley Women Watch Group chat. No one talked about milk prices or diaper sales that night. Instead, who would contact the press? Who would write the letter to the town council? Who would start the petition to suspend Matthew Taylor? One mother typed, "We're not activists. We're mothers. And if an old man in a veteran's jacket can be kicked to the ground and no one speaks up, what hope is there for our kids?" At Wexley Central High, students like Jalen Reddick quietly taped flyers around the halls, printed from the library copier. A photo of Mr. Raymond, captured in the moment he picked up his fallen badge, was printed in black and white. In red ink it read, "Don't wait until you've been kicked down to realize when you should have stood up." An older teacher nodded silently as he passed. He didn't stop them. He returned to the faculty lounge, tore up the agenda for next week's staff meeting, and replaced it with a handwritten sign. Community Forum, full attendance required. Then, as if Wexley hadn't already been pushed to the edge, a new tremor hit. Mira Thatch, a reporter for the Wexley Daily Echo, received an unmarked package. Inside, an old video cassette and a slip of paper with a single line. This wasn't the first time. Mira played the tape. The footage showed another man, also elderly, also black, being shouted at and shoved onto the hood of a pickup truck. The video was grainy, the timestamp long faded. But the voice, the laugh, the stance, there was no mistaking it. It was Matthew Taylor. And this time, the victim didn't survive. Mira froze, her hands suddenly cold. The town thought it had just woken up, but maybe it had been asleep too long. And beneath that slumber were dreams far more rotted than anyone dared imagine. That night, wind whistled through the brittle pine trees of Glenfield Heights. Raymond Elias Ford's wooden house stood alone at the end of a dirt road, its siding weather-worn, the tin roof clattering in the breeze. Inside, a dim yellow lamp cast a shadow against a wall covered in old mementos, a paratrooper badge, a torn map for Vietnam, and a faded photo of a young father standing in front of Fort Bragg with his son, Alexander, only 4 years old. Raymond sat quietly in his old armchair, his calloused hands holding the photograph, the one he'd picked up off the pavement that afternoon after Matthew Taylor's kick sent it flying. The dirt still smudged the edges, covering the smile of the boy who once believed his father was invincible. Now, that very father had become a victim of contempt in a society still pretending that prejudice was a thing of the past. He placed the photo on the table, then slowly opened a drawer and pulled out a small object, a silver-gray flip phone, scuffed and scratched. The screen was cloudy, the casing worn, but Raymond still remembered every key. No need to search the name. No need to scroll. The number was etched into his memory like the unit name once stitched across his uniform. Alexander McCallum, his son, now stationed at Ashgate Hold, commander of a Delta Force team. A ghost unit the world wouldn't know existed until the mission was already over. Raymond dialed a number. Each beep echoed through the room like the sound of a grenade pin being pulled. The line rang once. Then it connected. No greeting. No introduction. Raymond said just one thing, his voice low and steady, like rusted steel. "Son, come home." There was no reply on the other end. But Raymond knew. He'd heard. And for Alexander, this wasn't a request. It was a sentence. Raymond flipped the phone shut. The sharp click rang out like a safety being snapped back in place. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He simply leaned back into the chair, his hand resting gently over the paratrooper badge on his chest, still warm from the fall earlier. Outside the window, moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting broken shadows on the dusty ground, where footsteps had been and would return. But this time, the one returning wasn't a little boy watching his father through a soldier's binoculars. This time, the one returning was the nightmare. Hundreds of miles away, inside a dim operations room of the military base, Alexander McCallum, 38, opened his eyes under the red combat lights. No alarm needed. No warning sirens. Just one sentence from his father. Short, direct, like a round already chambered. And in that cold, precise stare, the storm had awakened. At Ashgate Hold, a black SUV slid silently through the gate. No sirens. No flashing lights. No goodbyes. Only two guards stood watching, motionless, then exchanged glances like they'd just witnessed something not found in any military manual. Because behind the wheel was the man every unit whispered about. The Phantom of Delta. Alexander McCallum didn't need to raise his voice to silence a room. He wore no rank, flaunted no medals, yet his file was locked behind the deepest clearance in the Department of Defense. The places he'd entered rarely existed on maps by the time he left them. And this time, he hadn't been deployed. He left on his own. No one dared to stop him. The SUV raced across the wind-blown hills, tires slicing the empty road like a verdict against the earth itself. On the dashboard sat a photo, Raymond Elias Ford, young, standing beside his small son. Alexander didn't look at it. He didn't need to. That face was burned into him like a tactical map carved into bone. Under the fading moonlight, the road into Wexley Borough appeared, serene, like a postcard town frozen in time. But Alexander wasn't coming to admire the view. He was coming to shut a door that should have never been opened. The gate to hell. At Caldera Pavilion, Matthew Taylor reclined in a chair, whiskey glass in hand, retelling the story of the stubborn old man who got taught a lesson. The young officers around him laughed like frat boys who'd just egged someone's house. One of them asked, "Hey, Matt, what did he do? Lawyer up?" Matthew snorted, raised an eyebrow. "Lawyer?" Man didn't say a damn word. Just stared at me like some geezer in a nursing home waiting to die. He took another sip, then added, "I'm a law in this town." Outside, tires whispered across pavement like a blade sliding through cloth. No one noticed. Seconds later, the barred door creaked open. A gust of cold night wind swept in, snuffing out half the overhead lights. A figure stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal coat. His eyes colder than the wind behind him. Alexander didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just stood there, empty-handed, carrying only silence, a weapon louder than anything the loudmouths in that room had ever heard. Matthew looked up. His gaze met Alexander's. And for a split second, the smirk on his face faltered, like a song abruptly stopped before the final crescendo. He didn't know why his palms started to sweat. He only knew one thing. Whatever had just walked through that door wasn't here to talk. It was here to end. The air inside Caldera Pavilion froze, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Alexander McCallum crossed the threshold, each step echoing off the old wooden floor with a dry, surgical precision. No one in the barn knew who he was. But they didn't need to. All they had to do was look into those eyes, cold, bottomless, indifferent as a blade worn down from slicing the line between war and justice. They knew. This man didn't come for a drink. Matthew shot to his feet, wobbling slightly. He tried to crack a smile, the alcohol still lingering on his breath. "What's this?" he slurred. "Halloween come early, big guy. You want an autograph or a beer?" Alexander didn't answer. He simply stared into Matthew's eyes, an unblinking, silent gaze like a snow-covered stone wall in the dead of winter. His hands hung at his sides, but the air pressure in the room seemed to gather around him, dense, heavy. A young officer joked, "Must be the old guy's kid, huh? Here to cash in on some sympathy check." He laughed, reaching out to slap Matthew on the shoulder. But before his hand could land, Alexander made a subtle turn of his left wrist, so slight, it was almost imperceptible. 1 second later, the young officer's wrist was locked, his entire body slammed down onto the table, face first into the wood with a muffled gasp. No blood, no broken bones, but the whole bar fell silent. Alexander let go. The man collapsed like a deflated sack of sand. Alexander turned back, stepped forward once more, now face to face with Matthew. They stood exactly 1 arm's length apart. No more. Matthew instinctively took a step back. His voice quivered slightly. "Ooh, who the hell are you?" Alexander didn't reply. Instead, he raised his arm slowly, pulling up his sleeve. On his solid forearm was an old tattoo, a Delta Force insignia, faded but still clear, a sword piercing through a silver shield, encircled by 2 folded eagle wings. Someone at the bar whispered aloud, "Delta." At that moment, the bar door swung open again. Brendan Cade, Matthew's longtime drinking buddy and fellow officer, entered, grinning, holding 2 bottles of bourbon. "Matt." I grabbed some more, but the words froze in his throat the second he saw Alexander. Alexander turned to him, his stare measuring Cade, as if calculating whether he should be dealt with first or last. Cade froze, paralyzed. Alexander turned back. He didn't strike. He didn't threaten. He simply bent down, picked up Matthew's half-finished whiskey, held it at eye level, and spoke for the first time during the entire encounter. "This isn't strong enough to wash away cowardice." Then he let go. The glass fell and shattered on the floor, fragments scattering like the mask on Matthew Taylor's face, cracking in that same instant. Matthew collapsed into the chair, his hands trembling uncontrollably, sweat pouring down his face like a man thrown into a nightmare he couldn't wake from. No one in the bar looked at him anymore. Every eye had turned to Alexander, the man who had just taught the entire town that some verdicts don't need a courtroom. Dawn had barely broken when Alexander McCallum pulled up in front of the Wexley Borough Police Department, a low, gray brick building with cracked walls and a nameplate tilted under rusted screws. In front of him stood a thick glass door, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights inside, a tired glow from a place that once called itself the symbol of law. Alexander stepped out of the vehicle. No rush, no mask. His left hand held a thick red dossier, stamped top secret, authorized eyes only. His right hand stayed casually in his pocket. He pushed the door open. A soft chime rang, and then fell silent, as if even the security system knew it had no authority to stop him. Inside, everything looked as dull as any other uneventful morning. A young officer sat at the front desk, scrolling on his phone, not even looking up. "You got an appointment?" the kid asked, eyes glued to the screen. Alexander walked straight toward the office marked with a tarnished brass plaque. "Chief Ronald Beckett." He didn't answer. He didn't knock. He simply nudged the door open. Everything inside went still. Ronald Beckett, 58, broad-shouldered, speckled gray beard, was halfway through a bite of his sandwich, flipping the newspaper. A steaming mug of coffee sat on his desk. But when he looked up and saw the man standing in the doorway, his eyes blinked once, then stopped. Alexander didn't need to threaten. He simply laid down a black military identification card on the desk. No logo, no rank, just one embossed line. Delta Force, code, Vanta Presence. Beckett started to rise. But before he could, Alexander placed a second item on the desk, a worn, thick file bearing the unique seal of the Department of Defense. The red header read, "Security Breach Assessment, Region 7D, Wexley." Alexander leaned in. His voice was low, but every syllable landed like a hammer driving nails. "Everything's in here. Every time Matthew Taylor broke protocol. Every missing report. Every complaint that died right here on your desk." Ronald Beckett's face flushed purple. His meaty hand trembled as it gripped the armrest. "Where did you get this?" Alexander didn't answer. He just stared, cutting through the last layer of denial still clinging to Beckett's face. "You have 2 choices," he said. "I can forward this file to the Department of Justice and let them clean house. Or you sign the suspension orders for everyone on that list, starting with Matthew Taylor. You don't have the authority, Beckett growled, though his breath had already quickened. Alexander gave a slight nod. Then he pulled out a third document from his pocket. A writ of internal authority, Tier Sigma. 1. Complete with encrypted signature from the Federal Office of Ethical Security. I do. And I'm not here to negotiate. Silence spread like spilled oil. An older officer, Tobias Reed, passed by the office window, saw Alexander, recognized the Delta badge, and gave a single nod. No one needed another reason. The truth was heavy enough to crush any fake order. Ronald Beckett said nothing more. Sweat rolled down his temple. He reached for the pen and signed. The building remained still, but from that moment, a system began to collapse. And Alexander was only just beginning. Once the final signature had marked the page, Alexander McCallum closed the dossier without another word of warning. Beckett didn't lift his head. He simply stared at the surface of his desk, as if it had just swallowed the career he once built on manipulation and silence. Alexander turned to leave, just as two young officers escorted Matthew Taylor into the lobby. His hands were cuffed behind his back. His face was pale. His lips trembled, though he forced a crooked smile. You can't do this to me. I'm a cop. I have rights. Tobias Reed stepped out from a side room, holding an old baton he hadn't touched in years. You do have rights, he said, voice heavy and worn. But you use them like a whip, not a shield. Alexander said nothing. He gave a glance toward the hallway behind him. The two officers understood immediately. They led Matthew out of the lobby, down a narrow corridor between old storage rooms, until they reached Hillcrest Yard, the yard behind the station, where the flagpole stood untouched for years. The iron pole was rusted, the ropes tangled, the ground beneath it littered with patches of dead grass. The American flag hung loosely, its edges frayed. Like it, too, had been waiting for a reason to be lowered. They stopped beneath it. Wind howled through the chain-link fence, clinking like distant echoes of old shackles. Matthew thrashed. No, what are you doing? This is humiliation of an officer of the law. Alexander stepped forward, slow and deliberate. He didn't need words. His presence was enough. From his coat, he pulled out an old military badge, Raymond's, still marked with the dust from that day. He held it up in front of Matthew. He never needed to cuff anyone, Alexander said, voice low and sharp. He never needed to scream to feel worthy. Then he turned to the two officers. Tie him to the pole. No force. Let him walk. Dragged toward the flagpole, Matthew felt his knees on the cold earth. A rope was looped around his torso, crossed over his chest, and secured tightly to the iron pole, tied by the very hands that once called him brother. No one defended him. No one objected. The entire yard sank into a heavy silence. Not the silence of fear, but of judgment. Alexander stood before him. You thought you couldn't be touched, he said. But this pole wasn't made for you to wave power. It's where people bow to something greater than themselves. Matthew bowed his head, sweat dripping to the ground, mixing with dust, as if he'd melted under a weight far heavier than rope, the weight of truth. No cameras, no videos, because this time, the whole town would remember with their own eyes, and with the shame they had carried in silence for far too long. Night had fully fallen by the time Matthew Taylor was returned to the interrogation room at Wexley Borough Station. Cold fluorescent lights above cast their pale glow on his face, now greenish, soaked in sweat. The ropes were gone, but the stairs surrounding him were shackles far heavier than cuffs. Across the table, Alexander McCallum didn't sit. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching. No need for torture, no threats. Just the quiet pressure of being in the presence of someone untouchable. Ronald Beckett stood in the corner, shoulders stiff, gaze distant, as if he, too, was now on trial. On the table lay a thick internal case file, proof of abuse of power, falsified records, and fabricated statements that Matthew had either authored or witnessed without objection. His name wasn't the only one in those pages, but this time, no one stood beside him. Do you have anything to say? Beckett asked, voice exhausted. Matthew swallowed dryly. For the first time in his life, He had no ready answer. No excuse. No system left to hide behind. A young officer, Jamal Reddick, who had once patrolled alongside Matthew, stepped forward. "I used to think he was the model," Jamal said, voice trembling but clear. "Now I just feel stupid." Jamal reached into his chest pocket and pulled out the silver badge he'd carried for 3 years. He placed it gently on the table, sliding it toward Matthew, not as a tribute, but as an indictment. Then he turned and walked out of the room. Silence settled again. Matthew stared at the badge, lips twitching as if trying to form words, but only shallow, broken breaths escaped. "You know why people hate you the most?" Alexander finally spoke, his voice steady and sharp. "It's not because you were harsh. It's because you were a coward. When you stood between right and wrong, you always chose the side you thought would protect your power." Ronald Beckett let out a long breath. He stepped forward, placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder in quiet agreement, then turned to Matthew. "You will issue a public apology," Beckett declared, like a sentence being handed down. "No press, no script, just a camera and the truth. And after that, you will no longer be a part of this department." Matthew lowered his head, covering his face, not because of pain, but because he had been stripped bare in front of those who once called him brother. From the hallway, there was a sudden sound, metal hitting tile. Everyone turned. Tobias Reed, the department's longest-serving officer, who had survived through 3 police chiefs, stood there. He looked at Matthew, then locked eyes with Beckett. "I've worn this for 32 years, he said, bending to pick up the badge he had just thrown. "But if it takes an old soldier and his son to remind us what honor is, then I have no reason to wear it anymore." He walked away without looking back. And that night, at Wexleyboro Police Station, in what was the quietest night in years, a system didn't fall from gunfire. It fell because the people inside began to walk away. 3 days later, Wexleyboro's Central Square wasn't quiet like usual. Under the noon sun, hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on a temporary stage built at the steps of City Hall. Journalists packed the media zone. Cameras pointed straight at the podium. On social media, the Nova 6 Ethics Tracker livestream had already surpassed 600,000 views in just 17 minutes. No one sat. No one spoke. No one smiled. They simply waited. And then Jason Kruger appeared. No police uniform. No gun belt. Just a man in a light gray shirt, stepping out from backstage, his eyes sunken, his steps heavy. Beneath the oak tree to the right of the platform, Alexander McCallum stood still. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But his presence alone held the entire space in silent restraint. Kruger stood at the microphone and inhaled deeply. He began, but his voice caught. His eyes swept across the crowd, locking briefly with the blank stares of former neighbors, former colleagues, and a group of high school students holding a sign that read, "Honor isn't a badge." "I abused my power," he said. "I did something unforgivable. I forgot that the law isn't meant to display strength. It's meant to protect dignity." A few people bowed their heads. Others remained completely still. There was no applause, but it wasn't needed. Kruger continued, "I disrespected an elderly veteran, a man who served this country before I was even born. I trampled over the very values I was supposed to defend." He paused, gripping the podium like it was the only thing holding him up. "I apologize to Mr. Raymond Elias Ford, to the entire community, and I resign all my positions permanently." From the rear seats, an older woman exhaled, a sound that held both grief and release. It was Delphine Rook, once bullied by Kruger during a forced property seizure back in 2016. Local TV zoomed in on Raymond Elias Ford, sitting quietly below. No rage, no applause, just watching, his dark eyes like ink on white paper. Indelible, unforgettable. Alexander stepped forward, placed a hand gently on his father's shoulder. And there, right in the plaza where a system once stayed silent before injustice, a single apology couldn't redeem the past, but it forced the present to confront it. Not everyone accepted it, but no one could pretend it hadn't happened. The next morning, Raymond Elias Ford left his house before dawn. A silver gray coat, draped his shoulders like a memory that could never be washed away. With his hand wrapped around a worn wooden cane, he walked across Wexley Federal Square, the same place where Jason Kruger had once been forced to bow before the people. No escort, no fanfare, just the wind, and the quiet steps of a man who didn't need to win to know he was right. He reached Hillcrest Memorial Grounds, where his wife, Margaret, rested beneath an old maple tree. He knelt down, gently placed a wildflower freshly picked from his backyard onto her headstone. No words, no tears. He simply sat, letting the breeze brush past the hands that once carried a rifle for this country. In the distance, a boy about 8 years old walked hand in hand with his mother. When he saw Raymond, he froze. He tugged her hand and whispered something. She bent down to listen, and something in her expression shifted. Then they started walking toward him. "You're the man from the video, aren't you, sir?" The boy's voice was timid but bright. Raymond didn't answer. He simply nodded. The boy slowly reached out and gently placed a single coin on the headstone, right next to the wildflower. A small act, yet it rang out like a bronze bell in the silence. "I'm in Miss Elston's class," the boy added, his voice trembling with emotion. "She said, you were the one who stood when the whole town looked away." Raymond looked at him, not with correction, not with pride, but with the gaze of a generation that once believed in healing, even when no one stood by them when it mattered most. The mother bowed in quiet gratitude, then took her son's hand and walked away. But their steps no longer hurried. They moved as if they'd just witnessed something, not on a screen, but in the very breath of the town they called home. That day, no news outlet covered what Raymond did. No one interviewed him. No tweet went viral. But in Wexley Borough, a place that once ignored him as he lay shoved to the ground, no one turned away anymore when they saw an elderly black man standing alone on the street. Not because they feared being filmed, but because for the first time, they were ashamed of having done nothing. Raymond didn't need to win. He didn't need to speak, because his silence, his unshaken stillness, had become its own form of verdict, one that made no sound, but was heavy enough to collapse an entire system built on forgotten truths. And sometimes, the greatest lesson isn't found in resistance, but in the quiet decision to rise again without striking back. Because those who truly understand justice know it doesn't need a shout. It only needs a soul that refuses to bow.